At my father's will reading, my stepmother lied I'd been cut off until my lawyer exposed her $71 million fraud, and she faced an inescapable sentence. My name is Carolina. I'm 32 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed I was the rejected daughter of a wealthy man. Today, as I type these words on the porch of the house where I grew up, a house that now officially belongs to me, everything that happened still seems surreal. I need to tell this story because it's not just about money or inheritance. It's about justice, manipulation, and how sometimes the people we trust most are the ones planning our downfall. I was sitting in the mahogany-paneled waiting room of Peterson & Associates law firm, my palms sweating despite the air conditioning running at full blast. The leather chair creaked every time I shifted, and I couldn't stop checking my phone. It was 2:47 in the afternoon. The reading of my father Eduardo's will was scheduled for 3 o'clock sharp, and my stepmother Lena hadn't arrived yet with her children, Leonardo and Marisol. Dad had been gone for 2 weeks now. They said it was a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. At 58, he seemed healthy enough, though I'd noticed he'd been more tired lately, more distant. Lena had been quick to take charge of the funeral arrangements, relegating me to a corner like an unwanted guest at my own father's goodbye. The heavy oak door opened with a dramatic creak, and there they were. Lena strutted in, wearing a black Chanel-style suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. Behind her, Leonardo and Marisol followed like loyal soldiers, both dressed in designer morning attire that looked more like they were attending a fashion show than a will reading. "Oh, Carolina, darling," Lena's voice dripped with false sympathy as she air-kissed near my cheeks. "I'm so sorry you had to wait. We were at the Mercedes dealership. Leonardo needs a more reliable car for college, and well, we thought it would be appropriate to handle these practical matters before." She gestured vaguely toward the lawyer's office door. Leonardo, now 19 and carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who'd never been told no, smirked at me. "Hope you're not too disappointed when you hear what Dad really thought about you, Carolina," he said, his tone casual, cruel in that special way only entitled teenagers could master. Marisol, 17 and every bit her mother's daughter, was already scrolling through her phone, probably calculating how much she could spend on her upcoming European graduation trip. "Mom, can we hurry this up? I have a spa appointment at 4, and you know how impossible it is to reschedule with Anastasia," she said. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, the same one I'd carried for 6 years, ever since Dad married Lena. It was the same knot that formed every family dinner when they discuss expensive vacations I wasn't invited to, or business decisions that apparently didn't concern me, even though I'd worked at Dad's company since graduating college. "The lawyer will see you now," a secretary announced from the doorway. Carlos Martinez looked exactly like what central casting would order for a distinguished attorney. Silver hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a presence that commanded respect. His office was impressive without being ostentatious, lined with law books and framed diplomas from Harvard and Yale. "Please take a seat," he gestured toward the conference table where 5 chairs had been arranged. I noticed some additional documents stacked beside his usual legal folders, and something about his expression seemed amused. No, that couldn't be right. This was a solemn occasion. Lena positioned herself at the head of the table as if she were chairing a board meeting, while Leonardo and Marisol flanked her sides. I took the chair farthest from them, feeling like an outsider in my own family's legal proceedings. "Before we begin," Carlos said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to express my condolences to all of you. Eduardo was not just a client but a friend for over 30 years. I handled his first business incorporation, his divorce from Carolina's mother, and—" He paused, looking directly at me, many other legal matters throughout the years. Lena's smile was sharp as a blade. "Thank you, Carlos. Eduardo spoke of you often. He trusted your judgment implicitly, which is why he came to you when he decided to make some adjustments to his estate planning." She glanced at me with barely concealed triumph. "Isn't that right, Carolina? Your father had some concerns about your lifestyle choices, your lack of commitment to the family business." My cheeks burned. It was true that Dad and I had grown distant over the years, especially after he married Lena. Family dinners became interrogations about my job performance, my dating life, my spending habits. Lena had a talent for making innocent questions sound like accusations, and somehow Dad always seemed to side with her version of events. Carlos opened the first folder, but instead of diving into the legal language, he leaned back in his chair. "This is certainly going to be an interesting afternoon," he murmured, almost to himself. The room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and irregular, as I braced myself for what I was certain would be my official disinheritance. "Well," Lena said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "shall we get this over with?" I'm sure Carolina is eager to hear what her father really decided about her future. The cruelty in her tone was no longer hidden behind false sympathy, and that's when everything began to unravel. During my father's marriage to Lena, I'd learned to read the subtle signs of impending humiliation, the way she'd tilt her head slightly to the right before delivering a particularly cutting remark, the practiced pause she'd use to build dramatic tension, the way her children would lean forward, anticipating the show they were about to witness. All those signs were there as Carlos opened the leather portfolio containing my father's final wishes. "Before we begin with the formal reading," Lena announced, standing up as if she were addressing a corporate board, "I think it's only fair that Carolina knows what to expect. She smoothed her skirt and faced me directly, her blue eyes cold as winter. Your father and I had many long conversations about the future of his estate, many difficult conversations about family loyalty, about contribution, about worthiness. Leonardo snickered from his chair, not even trying to hide his amusement. This is going to be epic, he whispered to Marisol, who looked up from her phone just long enough to smirk. Eduardo was deeply disappointed in you, Carolina, Lena continued, her voice gaining momentum like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. Your lack of ambition, your failure to appreciate the opportunities he provided, your inability to integrate properly into our family unit. For 6 years, I watched him struggle with the decision. But ultimately, she paused for maximum dramatic effect, savoring what she clearly believed was her moment of absolute triumph. He decided you don't deserve a single penny of what he worked so hard to build. You've been completely removed from the inheritance. Everything, the house, the business, the investments, the art collection, all of it, goes to the people who actually supported him, who were actually there for him in his final years. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt as though someone had punched me in the gut, even though part of me had been expecting this outcome for months, the way Dad had been looking at me lately, the way family conversations would stop when I entered the room, the way Lena had been making increasingly bold decisions about our family's future. But then something unexpected happened. Carlos started laughing. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous laugh, but a genuine deep belly laugh that seemed to echo off the oak-paneled walls. He removed his glasses, wiped his eyes, and continued laughing until Lena's triumphant expression began to crumble into confusion. I'm sorry, he managed between chuckles. It's just... Oh, Eduardo would have loved this moment. He predicted this exact scenario word for word. Lena, he even bet me $20 that you'd use the phrase family unit. Carlos reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, waving it in the air. He was right, as always. What are you talking about? Lena's voice had lost its confident edge, replaced by something that sounded dangerously close to panic. Oh, my dear Lena, Carlos said, his amusement still evident as he opened a thick folder marked confidential family trust documents. I think we need to have a little conversation about the difference between a will and a trust, specifically about something called a revocable family trust that your late husband established 29 years ago. The color drained from Lena's face as she slowly sank back into her chair. Leonardo and Marisol exchanged confused glances, their earlier smugness evaporating like morning mist. You see, Carlos continued, now all business despite the smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. A will only distributes assets that are actually owned by the deceased at the time of death. But if those assets have already been transferred to a trust, he spread several official-looking documents across the table. Well, then the will becomes rather irrelevant, doesn't it? I stared at the documents, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. Numbers jumped out at me, dollar amounts with so many zeros they didn't seem real. What exactly are you saying? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Carlos looked at me with something that might have been pride. I'm saying, Carolina, that your father was far more clever than any of us gave him credit for. And I'm saying that this family has been living in your house, driving your cars, and spending your money for the past year without even knowing it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Carlos spread out more documents across the polished conference table. Lena's perfectly manicured hands were trembling slightly as she reached for the papers, her eyes scanning the legal terminology that clearly meant nothing to her. I don't understand, she said, her voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier authority. Eduardo never mentioned any trust. We went over his finances, together every month. I have access to all his accounts. I signed all the important papers. Oh, you have access to some accounts, Carlos agreed pleasantly. The household accounts, the credit cards, the day-to-day operational funds, but those represented maybe 3% of Eduardo's actual wealth. He pulled out a calculator and began punching in numbers. Let's see. The monthly allowance he provided for household expenses was about $45,000. Very generous for running a home, wouldn't you say? Marisol's eyes widened. She'd been spending that much on shopping sprees without thinking twice about it. Wait, that was just an allowance, like, for groceries and stuff? Precisely, Carlos nodded. Your stepfather was quite methodical about financial boundaries. He believed in comfort, but also in, shall we say, controlled exposure to wealth for those who hadn't earned it themselves. Leonardo had gone pale beneath his designer tan, but the business, Mom sits on the board of directors. She makes decisions about millions of dollars in contracts. She sits on the board of Martinez Holdings LLC, Carlos corrected gently, which is a subsidiary management company that handles day-to-day operations. The actual ownership of all assets was transferred to the Eduardo Martinez Family Trust approximately 12 months ago, with Carolina as the sole beneficiary upon Eduardo's passing. I felt dizzy. The room was spinning slightly and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Carlos, what are you saying exactly? In plain English, please. The lawyer's expression softened as he turned to me. I'm saying that your father transferred everything, and I mean everything, into a trust fund with your name on it. The house you grew up in, the one where they've been living, yours. The company where you work, you own it. The investment portfolio, the art collection, the vacation properties in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard, all yours. He pulled out a summary sheet with numbers highlighted in yellow. The total value of the trust as of last month's assessment is $71,400,000. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the secretary's typewriter in the outer office. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked, and the normal world continued to exist while mine turned completely upside down. "That's impossible," Lena whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "I would have known. I would have seen the paperwork. I sign all the important documents." "You signed what Eduardo chose to show you," Carlos replied, his tone still professional but carrying an edge now. "And frankly, Lena, given what I've observed over the past few years, that was probably a wise decision on his part." "What's that supposed to mean?" Leonardo jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "Are you insulting our family?" "I'm not insulting anyone," Carlos said calmly. "I'm simply stating facts. Your mother has run up approximately $240,000 in credit card debt over the past 18 months. She's purchased 3 cars, planned 2 elaborate vacations, and has been telling her friends that she's planning to renovate the east wing of the house, all without consulting the actual owner of those assets." Marisol's phone clattered to the table as she stared at her mother. "Mom, is that true? About the credit cards?" Lena's composure was cracking like ice in spring. Those were necessary expenses, family expenses. The cars were for the children, the vacations were for family bonding, the renovation plans were to increase property value. "With whose money?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Lena turned to look at me, and for the first time in 6 years I saw something in her eyes that wasn't contempt or condescension. It was fear. It's family money. We're family." "No," Carlos interjected, pulling out another folder. "You're Eduardo's second wife, and your children are his stepchildren. The trust was established long before he met you, updated periodically but never changed in terms of the primary beneficiary. Carolina has been the heir apparent for 29 years. He handed me a document with my father's signature, and a date from when I was just 3 years old. Your father created this trust after your mother died, to ensure that his biological child would be protected no matter what happened to him, no matter who he married, no matter what influences might try to separate you from your inheritance." I stared at the signature, recognizing my father's careful handwriting. Even then, when I was barely old enough to tie my shoes, he'd been thinking about protecting me. The thought made my throat tight with emotion. "But he seemed so distant lately," I said. "He hardly talked to me anymore. At family dinners he'd just sit there while Lena criticized everything I did." Carlos smiled sadly. "Carolina, your father was dying. He'd known about the heart condition for 8 months, and he was watching very carefully to see how his wife would behave when she thought she was about to inherit everything." "You mean he was testing her?" Marisol asked, her voice small. "He was protecting you," Carlos replied, looking directly at me, "and gathering evidence about the kind of people he'd unfortunately allowed into his home." Lena shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. I loved Eduardo. I took care of him. I was a devoted wife." "You were planning to put him in a nursing home," Carlos said quietly. The room went dead silent. "I heard you on the phone with Sunset Manor Memory Care, Lena. Eduardo heard you too. You were inquiring about their rates for residents with early-stage dementia, discussing how to have someone declared incompetent for their own safety." Leonardo and Marisol turned to stare at their mother, horror dawning on their faces. "He wasn't developing dementia," I said, understanding flooding through me like cold water. "No, he wasn't," Carlos confirmed. "He was perfectly lucid right up until the end. Lucid enough to hire a private investigator 6 months ago. Lucid enough to record several conversations. Lucid enough to ensure that his real daughter would be protected from the people who saw him as nothing more than a paycheck." Lena collapsed back into her chair, all pretense of dignity abandoned. "I don't understand how this happened. How did I not know?" "Because you never bothered to learn about the business, about the real finances, about anything that mattered to Eduardo beyond spending his money," Carlos said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You knew he was wealthy, and that was enough for you. You never asked how the wealth was structured, never showed interest in his legal affairs, never bothered to understand that marrying a rich man doesn't automatically make you rich." He pulled out one final document. "Which brings us to the actual will, the document that governs the few assets that weren't already in the trust." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. "What few assets?" Carlos cleared his throat and began to read in his formal lawyer voice. "To my beloved wife, Lena Martinez, who has shown me exactly who she is, I leave the sum of $1. She has already taken far more than she deserves. To my stepson, Leonardo Martinez, I leave the sum of $1 with the hope that he will learn the value of earning his own way in the world. To my stepdaughter, Marisol Martinez, I leave the sum of $1 and the suggestion that she find a career that doesn't depend on other people's generosity." The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Marisol started crying, not the delicate tears of a grieving stepdaughter but the harsh sobs of someone whose entire future had just evaporated. "To my daughter, Carolina Martinez, I leave my love, my pride, and my confidence that she will use her inheritance wisely and kindly. She has already received everything else through the trust, as was always my intention." Carlos set down the will and looked around the table. "There's more, but I think we should address the immediate practical concerns first." He handed me a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "Your father asked me to give you this after the will reading. He said it would explain everything you need to know about his final year." Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out 3 smaller envelopes. "And these are for you, Lena, Leonardo, and Marisol." Lena opened hers with shaking hands. Her face went white as she read, then green, then white again. "What does it say, Mom?" Leonardo demanded. Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's an eviction notice. We have 30 days to vacate the premises." Carlos nodded matter-of-factly. All the properties, the main house, the Aspen cabin, the Martha's Vineyard cottage, they all belong to Carolina now. And she's made it clear she wants you out. "I never said that," I protested. Confused. "Actually, you did," Carlos replied with a slight smile. "You signed the eviction papers last week, though you didn't know what you were signing at the time. Remember when I asked you to come in to notarize some routine estate documents?" I remembered signing papers, lots of papers, trusting that Carlos knew what was best. I'd been so grief-stricken, I hadn't read them carefully. "Don't worry," he continued. "Your father wrote very specific instructions about how he wanted this handled. You're not the villain here, Carolina. You're just the rightful owner reclaiming what was always yours." I stared at the red wax seal on the envelope, my father's final message to me, while around the table the reality of the situation continued to sink in. Lena was reading and rereading her eviction notice as if the words might change if she looked at them long enough. Leonardo had gone completely silent, which was perhaps the most disturbing reaction of all. I'd never seen him speechless. Marisol was openly crying, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streams. "I need to understand something," I said, looking at Carlos. "You're telling me that my father knew exactly what Lena was doing and he let it happen for months?" Carlos leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Your father was many things, Carolina, but he wasn't naive. About 6 months after he married Lena, he started noticing things, small things at first, bills for items he'd never purchased, conversations that stopped when he entered a room, phone calls that ended abruptly when he walked by. So, he started investigating his own wife. He started protecting his daughter," Carlos corrected gently. "There's a difference. Eduardo came to me about 18 months ago, very quietly, very discreetly. He said he was concerned about the long-term security of his assets, and he wanted to ensure they would be properly managed after his death." Lena looked up from her eviction notice, her eyes blazing with renewed anger. "He was spying on me, his own wife." "He was documenting fraud," Carlos replied coolly, which, given what we discovered, was probably wise. "What fraud?" Leonardo demanded, though his voice lacked its usual arrogance. Carlos opened another folder, this one considerably thicker than the others. "Shall we start with the credit cards? The ones opened in Eduardo's name without his knowledge? Or perhaps the forged signatures on the investment account transfers? Or maybe we should discuss the rather creative medical bills that were submitted to insurance companies for treatments that never actually occurred." My stomach dropped. "Medical fraud?" "Your stepmother has been quite busy," Carlos said, pulling out a series of documents. "She's been submitting claims for physical therapy sessions that never happened, psychological counseling that was never provided, and prescription medications that were never prescribed. The insurance fraud alone carries a potential sentence of 15 years in federal prison." Marisol stopped crying abruptly. "Mom, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Lena protested, but her voice was shrill now, desperate. "Those were legitimate expenses. Eduardo was sick, he needed care. I was managing his health care because he was too proud to admit he needed help." "Eduardo was seeing Dr. Patricia Hendricks for his heart condition," Carlos said calmly. "One doctor, one condition, very straightforward treatment. The insurance claims show visits to 17 different specialists for conditions ranging from chronic pain syndrome to early-onset Alzheimer's disease." He handed me a medical report. "Your father never had Alzheimer's, Carolina. His mind was sharp until the very end, but the insurance payments for his supposed cognitive decline treatments were deposited directly into an account that Lena controlled." I felt sick. All those times I'd worried about Dad seeming distant or confused, all those moments when I thought he was losing his connection to reality. It had been an act. He'd been pretending to be sicker than he was while gathering evidence against his wife. "There's more," Carlos continued, seemingly immune to the emotional devastation he was causing. "The private investigator Eduardo hired documented some very interesting patterns in Lena's behavior. Patterns that go back further than her marriage to your father." He pulled out a thick report bound in blue covers. "Did you know, Lena, that your first husband's death is still considered suspicious by the Denver Police Department?" The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Leonardo and Marisol stared at their mother with expressions of growing horror. "That's ridiculous," Lena whispered, but she'd gone pale again. "James died of natural causes, heart attack, just like Eduardo." "James Martinez, no relation to your current family, died of a heart attack at age 45 in perfect health 2 days after changing his life insurance policy to make you the primary beneficiary," Carlos read from the report. "The autopsy found traces of digoxin in his system, a heart medication he'd never been prescribed." "You're making this up," Leonardo said, but his voice cracked on the words. "The Denver PD never had enough evidence to pursue charges," Carlos continued, "but they never closed the case either, and when Eduardo's private investigator contacted them about the similarities between the two deaths, he shrugged. Let's just say they're very interested in reopening their investigation." Marisol had started crying again, but these weren't tears of disappointment anymore. These were tears of absolute terror. "Mom, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you couldn't have." Lena stood up abruptly, knocking over her water glass. The sound of glass hitting the floor was sharp and final, like a judge's gavel. I don't have to listen to this. These are lies. All of it. Malicious lies from a man who was clearly losing his mind. Sit down, Carlos said, and something in his tone made Lena comply immediately. We're not finished. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind used for dictation. Your father recorded several conversations over the past few months. Would you like to hear some of them? That's illegal, Lena protested. Actually, it's not, Carlos replied. Colorado is a one-party consent state for recordings. Eduardo was perfectly within his rights to record conversations in his own home. He pressed play. Eduardo's voice filled the room, tiny but clear through the small speaker. Lena, I've been thinking about updating my will. Then Lena's voice, sweet and concerned. Oh, darling, why? You're not that sick. The doctor said the heart medication should help. I want to make sure you and the children are taken care of if something happens to me. What about Carolina? She's your daughter. There was a pause. Then Eduardo's voice, sounding tired. Carolina has made it clear she doesn't want to be part of this family. Maybe it's time I accepted that. Carlos stopped the recording. This conversation took place 3 weeks ago. Would you like to hear the one from the next day when you thought Eduardo was napping? He pressed play again, and this time it was clearly Lena's voice talking to someone on the phone. He's finally coming around. I've been working on him for months, but I think he's ready to cut her out completely. No? He still has moments of clarity, but they're getting shorter. The medication is helping with that. Yes, I've been crushing it into his food like you suggested. Carlos stopped the recording. The silence in the room was deafening. What medication were you crushing into his food, Lena? Carlos asked quietly. Lena was shaking her head frantically. I don't know what you're talking about. That can't be... We found the pills, Carlos said, hidden in your jewelry box. Haloperidol, an antipsychotic medication that, when given to someone who doesn't need it, can cause confusion, memory problems, and disorientation. Very useful if you want someone to appear mentally incompetent. Leonardo was staring at his mother as if he'd never seen her before. Mom, what have you done? I was trying to help him, Lena screamed. All pretense of composure finally shattered. He was getting agitated, paranoid. He was starting to suspect things that weren't true, accusing me of things I never did. The medication was to keep him calm. You were drugging him to make him compliant, Carlos said. And when that wasn't working fast enough, you started planning to have him declared incompetent so you could take control of his assets. He pulled out another document. Here's your application to Sunset Manor Memory Care, dated 3 weeks ago. You were planning to have Eduardo committed as soon as you could get a doctor to sign off on his supposed dementia diagnosis. I felt like I was drowning in information, each revelation worse than the last. How did he know all this? How did he stay ahead of her? Carlos smiled sadly. Your father was brilliant, Carolina, and he loved you more than you realized. Every strange conversation, every moment when he seemed confused or distant, he was performing for Lena while secretly documenting everything she was doing. He handed me another envelope. There are bank records showing the exact amount stolen, recorded phone conversations with insurance companies, video surveillance from the house, and detailed financial forensics going back 3 years. Your father built a case that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Why didn't he just divorce her, I asked. Why go through all this? Because he wanted to protect you completely, Carlos replied. A divorce would have entitled Lena to half of his assets under Colorado law. This way, with everything in the trust, she gets nothing, and more importantly, she can never make any legal claim against your inheritance. He looked around the table, at the devastated faces of my step-family. The only question now is what Carolina wants to do with all this evidence. The weight of that question, what I wanted to do with all this evidence, settled over me like a heavy blanket. I looked at the faces around the table. Lena, cornered and desperate. Leonardo, shocked into silence. Marisol, crying quietly. And Carlos, waiting patiently for my decision. The power to destroy these people's lives was literally in my hands, contained in folders full of documents and recordings. Before you decide anything, Carlos said gently, there's one more document your father wanted you to see. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. The paper was heavier than the others, expensive stationery that he used for important correspondence. This is Eduardo's final letter to you. He wrote it 2 weeks before he died and asked me to give it to you after you'd heard everything else. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. My father's voice seemed to speak directly to me through his careful cursive writing. My dearest Carolina, if you're reading this, then Carlos has done his job, and you now know the truth about what has been happening in our family. I'm sorry you had to learn about it this way, but I needed you to hear it from someone you trust. Someone who could present the facts clearly and help you make informed decisions about your future. I want you to know that every cold word, every distant look, every moment when I seemed to choose them over you, it was the hardest performance of my life. Watching you hurt, watching you wonder if I still loved you, nearly broke my heart a dozen times, but I had to make Lena believe she was winning. I had to let her reveal her true nature completely. You are my daughter, my greatest achievement, my proudest legacy, not because of anything you'll inherit, but because of who you are. You're kind without being weak, strong without being cruel. You have your mother's gentle heart and I hope my determination to do what's right, even when it's difficult. By now, you know about Lena's crimes, about the fraud and manipulation, and worse. The evidence is overwhelming, and if you choose to pursue criminal charges, she will almost certainly go to prison for a very long time. Her children, who I believe are more foolish than truly evil, will face their own consequences. But the choice is yours, Carolina. You could destroy them all with what we've uncovered, and no one would blame you. They tried to steal your birthright. They drugged me. They planned to have me declared incompetent. They deserve whatever justice you decide to pursue. However, I hope you'll consider another path, not because they deserve mercy, but because you deserve peace. Revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but it rarely brings the closure we hope for. Instead, it often chains us to the very people we're trying to escape. I've structured things so that you have complete control. They can never touch your inheritance, never make legal claims against you, never hurt you financially. You are protected absolutely. Whether you choose justice or mercy is entirely up to you. Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of you, and I love you more than words can express. Your devoted father, Eduardo. I folded the letter carefully, my eyes burning with tears I'd been holding back for weeks. Around the table, everyone was watching me, waiting to see what kind of person I really was when given ultimate power over people who had wronged me. I need some air, I said quietly, standing up from the table. Carlos nodded. Take all the time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready to discuss next steps. I walked out of the law office and onto the busy street, letting the sounds of normal life wash over me. People hurrying to meetings, couples having lunch, teenagers laughing as they walked past, all of them living their lives without knowing that just inside that building, a family was falling apart, and a daughter was deciding their fate. 20 minutes later, I returned to the conference room. Lena, Leonardo, and Marisol were still sitting in their chairs, looking like defendants waiting for a verdict. Carlos was reviewing some papers, giving them space to process everything they'd learned. I've made my decision, I announced, taking my seat again. Lena looked up at me with something that might have been hope mixed with terror. Carolina, please, I know how this looks, but... No, I interrupted firmly. You don't get to explain anymore. You don't get to manipulate the narrative or make excuses. You've done enough talking. I turned to Carlos. I want the criminal evidence turned over to the authorities. All of it, the insurance fraud, the prescription drug theft, the forgery, everything. Marisol let out a small sob. Please, Carolina, think about what this will do to us. I am thinking about it, I replied. I'm thinking about what you were planning to do to my father. I'm thinking about how you drugged him, isolated him, and planned to have him committed to steal his life's work. Leonardo finally found his voice. What about us, Marisol and me? We didn't know what she was doing. I studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding. Didn't you? You never wondered where the money for your cars came from, for your expensive clothes, your trips, your college tuition. You never asked why Dad suddenly seemed confused sometimes, why he started forgetting things. We thought he was just getting old, Marisol whispered. No, you thought you were getting rich, I corrected. And you didn't care enough about him as a person to notice that something was wrong. Carlos cleared his throat. Carolina, what about the eviction notices? Do you want to proceed with those as well? I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about my father's letter, about his advice to choose peace over revenge. But I was also thinking about justice, about consequences, about the fact that these people had tried to steal not just money, but my father's dignity and autonomy in his final months. Yes, I said finally. They have 30 days. I want them out of all the properties. Where are we supposed to go? Lena demanded, some of her old arrogance creeping back into her voice. We don't have anywhere else. You should have thought about that before you decided to commit multiple felonies, I replied calmly. You're adults, figure it out. Carlos was taking notes, documenting my decisions. What about the company? Lena is technically still on the board of directors of the management subsidiary. Remove her immediately and conduct a full audit of every decision she's been involved in for the past 2 years. If we find any other irregularities, add them to the criminal complaint. This is insane. Leonardo stood up, finally showing some emotion. You're destroying our entire family over what? Some pills that help Dad stay calm? Some paperwork mistakes? Sit down, I said, and something in my voice made him comply immediately. Let me explain something to all of you since you seem to be confused about what happened here. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where my father had built his business, where he'd raised me, where he'd tried to build a new family, only to discover he'd invited predators into his home. You didn't just steal money, I said, turning back to face them. You stole my father's peace of mind in his final year. You made him afraid in his own home. You forced him to pretend to be losing his mind while he gathered evidence to protect me from you. My voice was getting stronger, more certain. You isolated him from his friends, controlled his medications, and planned to have him declared incompetent so you could steal everything he'd worked 40 years to build, and you did it all while pretending to love him, while calling yourselves his family. Lena was crying now, but I felt no sympathy for her tears. You made me doubt his love for me. For 6 years, you systematically tried to turn him against me, and in his final months, you made me believe you'd succeeded. Do you have any idea what that felt like? Watching my father die thinking he didn't love me anymore? We never tried to turn him against you, Marisol protested weakly. Every family dinner where you criticized my job, My appearance, my life choices, I said. Every time you made jokes about my lack of ambition or my inability to appreciate what I had. Every time you planned expensive family trips that I wasn't invited to or made decisions about our family's future that didn't include me, you spent 6 years making me feel like an outsider in my own father's life. I sat back down, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely relieved. The truth was finally out, all of it. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. So yes, you're going to face the consequences of your choices, all of them. But I want you to understand that this isn't revenge, this is justice, and it's protection for me and for any other wealthy widower who might be unfortunate enough to attract your attention in the future. Carlos had been silent throughout my speech, but now he spoke up. There's one more thing, Carolina. Your father left specific instructions about what to do if you chose to prosecute. He handed me another envelope, this one marked to be opened only if criminal charges are filed. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000 and a note, for legal fees and security expenses. I knew you'd make the right choice. Love, Dad. He knew I'd choose to prosecute? I asked. He hoped you would, Carlos replied. He said anyone strong enough to survive 6 years of psychological manipulation and still be standing would be strong enough to see justice done. He pulled out one final document. There's also this, a restraining order that prohibits any of them from contacting you directly or indirectly after today. Any attempt to reach out to you, to approach your properties, or to interfere with your life in any way will result in immediate arrest. I looked at the restraining order, then at the 3 people who had spent 6 years trying to erase me from my father's life. They looked smaller now, diminished, like the petty criminals they'd revealed themselves to be. Is there anything else? I asked Carlos. Just one more thing, he said, pulling out a thick folder. Your father's plans for the Eduardo Martinez Foundation for Family Protection. He wanted you to have the option of using part of your inheritance to help other families who might be dealing with similar situations, elder abuse, financial manipulation, predatory relationships. I opened the folder and found detailed plans for a foundation that would provide legal assistance, private investigation services, and counseling for families dealing with financial predators. It was comprehensive, thoughtful, and so perfectly like my father to turn his own painful experience into a way to help others. He really thought of everything, didn't he? I said softly. He loved you very much, Carlos replied, and he wanted to make sure you had every tool you needed to build a good life, free from the people who tried to destroy it. 3 days later, I sat in the same conference room with Carlos, but this time, we weren't alone. Detective Maria Santos from the Denver PD had driven down specifically to discuss the case against Lena, and Assistant District Attorney James Wright was reviewing the mountain of evidence my father had compiled. I have to say, this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of elder abuse and financial fraud I've ever seen, Detective Santos said, flipping through bank records. Your father essentially built our entire case for us. How long before arrests are made? I asked. We'll have warrants by the end of the week, Ada Wright replied. The insurance fraud alone is enough for federal charges, but with the medication tampering and the evidence suggesting she may have done this before, he shrugged. Lena Martinez is looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. What about Leonardo and Marisol? That depends on what we find when we dig deeper into their involvement, Detective Santos said. If they genuinely didn't know about the fraud, they might escape criminal charges, but the financial impact on them will be severe regardless. Carlos had been quiet during most of the meeting, but now he spoke up. Carolina, there's something else we need to discuss. The media is starting to pick up on this story. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? A reporter from the Denver Post called this morning, asking about the connection between Eduardo's death and the reopened investigation into James Martinez. It won't be long before they put the pieces together. Ada Wright nodded grimly. High-profile financial fraud cases always attract media attention, especially when there's a potential serial killer angle. We can try to keep your name out of it for now, but eventually I'll be the grieving daughter who inherited millions while her stepmother gets arrested for murder, I finished. Great. There are worse things to be known for, Detective Santos said with a slight smile. Trust me, public sympathy is going to be entirely on your side in this one. That afternoon, I drove to the house where I'd grown up for the first time since Dad's funeral. The moving trucks were already there. Lena, Leonardo, and Marisol were packing up their belongings under the watchful eye of a court-appointed supervisor, as required by the restraining order. I didn't get out of my car immediately. Instead, I sat in the driveway, looking at the massive colonial house that had been my childhood home, trying to reconcile the warm memories of my early years with the cold reality of what it had become under Lena's influence. The front door opened and Lena emerged carrying a box. She saw my car and stopped dead, her face going through a series of emotions: anger, fear, sadness, and something that might have been shame. For a moment, I thought she might try to approach me despite the restraining order, but the court supervisor stepped outside and said something that made her continue walking to the moving truck. Leonardo appeared next, struggling with what looked like a very expensive sound system. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of his usual designer clothes, and the difference was startling. Without the expensive facade, he looked like what he really was, a scared 19-year-old kid whose entire world had just collapsed. Marisol was the last to emerge, carrying only a small suitcase. She looked around at the house, the gardens, the circular driveway with its fountain, as if she were memorizing it. When she spotted my car, she didn't look angry or defiant like her mother and brother. She just looked lost. I finally got out of the car and walked toward the house. The court supervisor, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, approached me. "Miss Martinez? I'm Janet Collins from the county court. I'm here to ensure the move-out proceeds smoothly and that all parties comply with the legal requirements." "How is it going?" I asked. "Efficiently," she replied. "They're taking only personal belongings and items they can prove they purchased themselves. Everything else stays with the house." I nodded and walked up the front steps, stepping into the foyer for the first time in weeks. The house felt different already, lighter somehow, as if a heavy presence had been lifted from it. The expensive artwork was still on the walls, the Persian rug still covered the hardwood floors, but the oppressive atmosphere that had developed over the past few years was already beginning to fade. "Carolina." I turned to find Marisol standing at the bottom of the grand staircase, her suitcase in her hand. She looked younger than her 17 years, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely vulnerable. "I'm not supposed to talk to you," she said quietly, glancing toward where the court supervisor was reviewing paperwork. "But I wanted to say, I'm sorry about everything." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but I saw only genuine remorse. "Are you sorry you did it? Or sorry you got caught?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry I never asked questions. I'm sorry I just went along with everything because it was easier than thinking about where the money was coming from. I'm sorry I was mean to you at family dinners because it made Mom happy." She wiped her eyes. "And I'm sorry about what happened to your dad. He didn't deserve any of what we did to him." It was probably the most honest thing any of them had said since this whole nightmare began. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. "I don't know. Mom's assets are frozen pending the criminal investigation. Leonardo's going to have to drop out of college. We can't afford the tuition anymore. I guess I'll finish high school and try to get a scholarship somewhere." She shrugged. "Maybe it's time we learned how to take care of ourselves." "Martinez," the court supervisor called from the front door. "Time's up. The truck needs to leave." Marisol picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back to me one last time. "For what it's worth, your dad talked about you all the time. Even when Mom was trying to make him angry about you, he'd always end up telling stories about when you were little, about how proud he was of you. I think maybe part of him always knew what we were really like." She left without waiting for my response, climbing into the passenger seat of a beat-up sedan that looked like it belonged to a friend or relative. Leonardo loaded the last of their boxes into the moving truck, avoiding eye contact with me entirely. Lena was nowhere to be seen. She must have left earlier. The court supervisor approached me with a clipboard. "Everything's been documented and removed according to the court order. The house is officially yours again, Ms. Martinez." I signed the paperwork and watched as the moving truck pulled out of the driveway, carrying away the last physical traces of the people who had tried to steal my father's life and my inheritance. As they disappeared around the corner, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. Walking through the house alone, I could almost hear echoes of my childhood. My mother's laughter from the kitchen, my father's voice calling me down for breakfast, the sound of my own footsteps running up and down these same stairs as a little girl who felt completely safe and loved in this place. In my father's study, I found something the movers had missed, or maybe something Dad had hidden so well that Lena never found it. Behind a false panel in his desk drawer was a photograph of me at my college graduation with a note in his handwriting, "My greatest achievement. I love you always, Dad." I sat in his leather chair, holding the photo and the note, and for the first time since his death, I felt truly connected to him again. The distance that had grown between us in his final years hadn't been real. It had been a performance, a sacrifice he'd made to protect me from people who would have destroyed us both if they'd had the chance. My phone buzzed with a text from Carlos. Media picked up the story. "You might want to avoid social media for a while. Call me if you need anything." I turned off my phone and sat in the gathering darkness of my father's study in my house, surrounded by the inheritance he'd fought so hard to preserve for me. Tomorrow, I would start dealing with the foundation, with the media attention, with the complexity of managing $71 million in assets. But tonight, I just wanted to sit here and remember that I was my father's daughter, that I was loved, and that I was finally truly safe. 6 months later, I was sitting in the boardroom of what was now officially called Martinez Holdings, reviewing quarterly reports with my new management team. The company Dad had built was thriving under proper leadership, and I discovered I had more of a head for business than anyone, including myself, had realized. My assistant knocked on the door. "Carolina, Carlos Martinez is here for your 2 o'clock appointment." "Send him in." Carlos walked in, carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that managed to be both satisfied and slightly grim. "I have news about the criminal cases." I gestured for him to sit. "Good news or bad news?" "Good news for justice. Complicated news for closure," he replied, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Lena took a plea deal yesterday. 25 years for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree." Murder in the first degree? They proved she killed her first husband. The Denver PD found enough evidence to file charges, and once they did, Lena's attorney advised her to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. Apparently, the combination of the digoxin in James Martinez's system and the similar attempts on your father were enough to establish a pattern. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what Lena had done. 25 years means she'll be in her 70s when she gets out. If she gets out, Carlos corrected, the federal insurance fraud charges are being handled separately, and those could add another 15 years to her sentence. What about Leonardo and Marisol? Leonardo was charged with accessory after the fact and conspiracy to commit fraud. He'll serve 2 years, probably less with good behavior. The prosecution believes he genuinely didn't know about the murder attempts, but he definitely knew about the financial fraud and chose to benefit from it rather than report it. Carlos opened his folder and pulled out several documents. Marisol was sentenced to community service and probation. The judge took into account her age and her cooperation with the investigation. She's actually doing well. Got a scholarship to Colorado State and is studying social work. Social work? She says she wants to help families dealing with abuse situations. Apparently, testifying against her mother was a wake-up call about the kind of person she wants to be. I thought about the scared 17-year-old who had apologized to me in the foyer 6 months ago. Maybe there was hope for her after all. There's something else, Carlos continued. The Eduardo Martinez Foundation for Family Protection officially received its nonprofit status last week. You're ready to start operations whenever you want. I looked out the window at the city skyline, thinking about my father's vision of turning his painful experience into something that could help others. I want to start with cases similar to ours. Older adults who are being financially manipulated by family members or caregivers. I've already identified 12 potential cases through the district attorney's office, families who could use both legal assistance and private investigation services to document what's happening to them. Carlos handed me a file. This one in particular might interest you. A 73-year-old widower, second wife half his age, adult children who've been cut out of his life, and a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior that his doctors can't explain. I opened the file and read the summary. The parallels to my father's situation were chilling. How did you find this? His daughter contacted me after seeing the news coverage of your case. She's desperate for help but can't afford a private investigator or the kind of legal team it would take to build a solid case. Set up a meeting, I said immediately. And Carlos, I want to handle this one personally. Are you sure? It might be emotionally difficult, given the similarities to your own situation. I thought about my father's letter, about his hope that I would use my inheritance to protect others. I'm sure. This is exactly why Dad wanted me to start the foundation. 3 weeks later, I sat across from Margaret Chen, a 45-year-old nurse whose 73-year-old father had married a 38-year-old woman 8 months after his wife's death. The story Margaret told was like listening to my own experience played back with different names and faces. She's isolated him from all his friends, Margaret explained, tears in her eyes. He used to call me every Sunday, and now I'm lucky if I hear from him once a month. When I do talk to him, he sounds confused, forgetful. But Dad was sharp as a tack his whole life. What about his finances? She's convinced him to add her name to all his accounts, supposedly to help him manage his affairs. He's worth about $4 million, and she's already spent close to $300,000 on household improvements and a new car for her son from her first marriage. I handed Margaret a contract for the foundation services. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to provide you with a private investigator, a forensic accountant, and a team of lawyers. We're going to document everything that's happening, build a case, and help you protect your father. Margaret stared at the contract. I can't afford this. I'm a single mother. I work 2 jobs just to pay rent. You don't pay anything, I explained. The Eduardo Martinez Foundation covers all costs for families dealing with financial elder abuse. That's what it's for. She started crying again, but this time with relief rather than despair. I thought I was going to lose him. I thought there was nothing I could do. There's always something you can do, I said, thinking of my father's careful planning and his determination to protect me. Sometimes it just takes time to figure out what that is. Over the next 6 months, we helped Margaret build a case against her father's wife that resulted in criminal charges and the recovery of most of the stolen money. More importantly, we helped her father understand what had been happening to him and supported him through the process of reclaiming his life and independence. It was the first of many similar cases. The foundation grew quickly, handling dozens of situations involving financial elder abuse, predatory relationships, and family manipulation. Each case was different, but the patterns were always similar: vulnerable people being exploited by those who claimed to love them. 1 year after my father's death, I stood in the cemetery where he was buried, carrying a folder full of the foundation's first annual report. We'd helped recover over $12 million in stolen assets, assisted in the prosecution of 17 predators, and provided support services to more than 200 families. We did it, Dad, I said quietly, placing the report on his gravestone. We turned what they tried to do to us into something that helps other people. A year and a half later, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Marisol, now in her 2nd year of college. Dear Carolina, I hope it's okay that I'm writing to you. I know I'm not supposed to contact you directly, but I wanted you to know that I'm graduating next month with my degree in social work. I've been accepted to graduate school to specialize in elder abuse prevention. I think about what my family did to you and your father every day. It's part of why I chose this field. I want to spend my life making sure what happened to your dad doesn't happen to other people. I know you'll probably never forgive me, and I understand why, but I wanted you to know that your decision to prosecute my mother probably saved other people's lives. And I wanted you to know that at least one person who was part of hurting you is now trying to spend her life helping others instead. I hope you're happy, and that the foundation is doing well. I read about it in the newspaper sometimes, and it makes me proud that something good came from something so terrible. Thank you for showing me what justice looks like and what integrity means. Sincerely, Marisol. I read the letter twice, then filed it away with the other foundation correspondence. I never responded to it. The restraining order was still in effect, and I had no desire to reconnect with any of them. But I was glad to know that Marisol had found a way to transform her experience into something positive. Leonardo, according to Carlos's occasional updates, had struggled more after his release from prison. He'd developed a drinking problem and had trouble holding down jobs. Some people, it seemed, learned from their consequences, while others were crushed by them. Lena was serving her sentence in a federal prison in Texas. She would be eligible for parole in 2043, when she would be 72 years old. I tried not to think about her at all. As for me, I discovered that my father had been right about something else. I was stronger than I'd realized. Managing a $71 million estate and running a foundation turned out to be work I was not only capable of doing, but work I genuinely enjoyed. I hired good people, made smart investments, and found purpose in using my father's legacy to protect other families. I also started dating again, something I'd avoided during the difficult years with Lena's family. I met David, a fellow nonprofit director, at a conference on elder abuse prevention. He was kind, funny, and completely unimpressed by my money, which made him exactly the right kind of person for me to fall in love with. 3 years after Dad's death, David and I were married in a small ceremony in the garden of the house where I grew up. Carlos walked me down the aisle, and Margaret Chen was my maid of honor. The Eduardo Martinez Foundation had become one of the most respected elder advocacy organizations in the country, and I'd found a life that felt authentic and meaningful. Standing in that garden, surrounded by people who cared about me for who I was rather than what I owned, I could almost feel my father's presence. He'd protected me from predators, preserved my inheritance, and given me the tools to build something beautiful from the wreckage of his final years. The most important thing I learned from the whole experience was this: people will show you who they really are if you give them enough time and opportunity. The key is believing them when they do and having the courage to act on that knowledge. My father saw Lena's true nature and built a case to protect me from it. I saw the evidence and chose justice over revenge. Marisol saw the consequences of her family's actions and chose to dedicate her life to preventing similar harm. In the end, we all became exactly who we were meant to be. Some of us became protectors, some became healers, and some became prisoners of their own choices. But all of us learned that actions have consequences, that love requires sacrifice, and that sometimes the greatest inheritance you can leave someone isn't money. It's the knowledge that they are worthy of protection, capable of strength, and deserving of justice. My father gave me all of that, along with $71 million and a purpose that would last the rest of my life. It was, I realized, exactly the inheritance I needed.